The importance of bleeding Kansas prior to the Civil War, while my partner Sebastian does his illustrations through whiteboard art.
To become a new state, this has created its fair share of conflicts across the nation. Before then, the Missouri Compromise had been passed in 1820 to balance the desires of slave and free states. The act had essentially stated anything below the compromise line is a slave state, anything above it is a free state. But it had been challenged by the Kansas Act of 1854, as Kansas and Nebraska were territories that did not follow the Missouri Compromise. Instead of denying these territories that later become states, Kansas-Nebraska Act basically stated that the Kansas had the choice of whether to become a slave state or a free state, with the ability to vote on said decision, making them worry about what side would be gaining more power, and eventually lead to the demise of the other. One key thing to remember is that there was no regulation as to who could vote in the state of Kansas. What better way to push your beliefs than to travel to Kansas and take control of the polls yourself? Exactly what both sides did. A new, unforeseen problem was about to arise in the state of Kansas and in the U.S. as a whole. Here are some notable figures to discuss. Congress, depicted by the middle picture, consisted of politicians and members of Congress, who each had their own separate beliefs. As northern states toward the notion of a free state, while southern congressmen refused the thought of having another free state. On the left is John Brown. He was known rebel during Bleeding Kansas, a man known for raiding weapon storages and spreading the word of abolition through the country during the latter stages of his life. He'd be doing this until his eventual capture with his group in 1859, where he would be the only one to be hanged and killed for his actions. The African American population. Not just a single African American was being affected by the decision, it was the whole population. Although abolition had been a lingering objective for years by then, Kansas were to become a red state, the possibility could dwindle. And if it were to become blue, they could have a new state to essentially run to, and they have the support of in a foreshadowed revolution. Having elections become a state, as I said, anyone could come in and vote. Kansas had become flooded with new inhabitants ready to preach and vote for their beliefs. Both sides had come in the beginning simply to create propaganda against one another in the basic political warfare and urge current inhabitants to vote for their respective policies. In the beginning, both sides were unaware of the deceitful intentions of one another, but as more people came into Kansas to vote themselves and persuade others to vote, some were unaware of what the other side was doing, even though they were doing the exact same thing. Although now there are regulations to voting in other states, back then it was all paper ballots, so anyone could have gone into the state to sway the polls they wanted. Some plans even included how to keep one another away from the state of Kansas and kicking them back out to their respective states. These plans came from a state of anger that had started to fuel both sides at what would become a more violent and bloody terror. Had created a frustration on both sides of the country due to the fact that both their ideals were completely different. Violence had erupted. What was once a more verbal dispute had become a bloody warfare decided. The country was split, both sides not being able to agree on what was the best for the Union. News had spread in the red and blue states of what was going on, so they each joined their respective sides in Kansas to possibly fight for what they believed in. Their attempts at swaying the polls, even causing minor altercations in the streets of Kansas. Some had taken even more drastic measures to ensure their way of life had a lowered possibility of changing in supply. It consisted of groups of Southern people with extreme beliefs and extreme enough to physically fight with whoever entered Kansas wanting to vote for the state to become free. These groups would stay near populated border entries and either scare away the Northerners or capture them in order to hang them and set an example for others attempting to cross. The methods used would be very gruesome at times, and essentially set the image for what we know as Bleeding Kansas. More than slavery itself, completely ignoring what was the real issue in Kansas and in the Union in general. While also doing this, they ignored the people of Kansas themselves and the true issues with slavery. As for abolition, both sides were in complete disagreement. The South did not want to lose their workforce because they needed the labor to provide for their way of life, which was generally farm. While they consisted mostly of cities and factories with paid workers, their way of life was on complete opposite spectrums, and the country's division had become more apparent. The events of Bleeding Kansas had further deepened the rift between both sides because it showed the extent the people were willing to go for their beliefs. Abolition had already been a lingering subject, but it had become a widespread subject in all over America, making the different states on high alert and ready to protect or fight for whatever they believed in. I say somewhat because the violence generally didn't stop, it simply died down. The warfare was only happening in small cases, and it was less talked about in the papers during the last year. As for the solution, Kansas had become a free state in 1861, years after the end of Bleeding Kansas. It was a temporary solution that caused an even bigger problem because Southerners were still opposing the decision and were outraged at the fact that they couldn't get it to become a slave state. Both sides wanted at the end of the day was power over the other. If Bleeding Kansas had not been violent and a state was simply decided on, the power factor would still be in play. As for the outcome, whether it became red or blue, either side would be outraged and lead to more disputes like it in other states. And due to the violence, there was no turning back, heightening the up-and-coming want for revolution in the United States. Sebastian, thank you for watching.